like we are ready.
Giving you guys a thumbs up. I would wait for John to put something in the chat box. So.
Yes.
But you guys are good.
Right. Good. So I think we will begin. Yes. Okay. Hello, everybody, and buenas tardes a todos. So we are celebrating here. We're doing our celebration for Hispanic Heritage Month, our department, World Languages and Cultures, and we have a wonderful guest today to be part of this big celebration. So I'm going to talk about our speaker, Beth Boyd. Beth is a future faculty teaching fellow for Indiana University East, as well as a doctoral candidate in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Indiana University Bloomington. She received her MA in Hispanic Studies from the University of Illinois at Chicago in 2013. Her research focuses on the intersection of colonial frameworks and visual cultural studies in the Americas, with a particular focus on Mexico and its transatlantic connections to early modern iconography. Her presentation today is titled Colonial Foundations, Digital Futures, Recasting the Spanish Conquest in 21st Century Social Media. So Beth, thank you so much for speaking for all the community here today. And well, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burgos. And thank you as well to especially the World Languages and Cultures Department. Thank you to Dr. Diane Moneypenny, Dr. Julian Simon, as well as the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. I want to thank Dean Snyder, as well as the IUE's Office of Communications and Marketing, who have made the streaming possible. Great. Well, this talk that I'm giving today is based on a book project that I've been working on with Dr. Kathleen Ann Myers and a series of authors at IU Bloomington. And the title of it is Contemporary Colonialities Mexico and Beyond, with the focus on this idea of coloniality. Here we are in 2021, 500 years after the conquest of Mexico, and we were seeing a lot of cultural products come to the fore. We were looking at films such as Roma that was coming out of Netflix. We were looking at La Reina del Sur, which is a series, a television series. And what was really calling my attention was these memes and viral videos and social media accounts that were coming up and really discussing this idea of we're 500 years out, but we're still wrestling with these ideas of our colonial inheritances throughout the Americas, in the US, in Mexico, and Canada. But the paper I want to present today is particularly looking at social media accounts in Mexico as they're kind of revisiting this idea of colonialism. And so with your permission, Felix, I'll give it a go. I'll start. Okay. On December 11, 2019, Senator Soledad Luevano Cantú introduced a controversial series of reforms under the administration of Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. The senator argued that Carlos Salinas de Gortari's Ley de Asociaciones Religiosas y Culto Público, laws that fundamentally reestablished federal ties with the papacy after decades of estrangement, lacked the necessary interventions to represent Mexico as a religiously diverse entity in the 21st century. Luevano affirmed that this process could be achieved through greater cooperation between religious organizations and Mexico's federal government. The reforms would allow religious groups such liberties as access to the press, right of entry to community spaces, and the ability to pursue economic gain. More notably, the initiative removed formal language that affirmed the historical separation of church and state. Luevano insisted that her initiatives reflected a strong belief in, quote, the democratic state, secularism, and true democracy, end quote. Others, such as Associate Justice José Ramón Pocio Díaz, responded publicly, however, that the initiatives existed simply as un retroceso a la laicidad, por más que se trate de disfrazar de libertad religiosa, a return to kind of a theocracy, even if it's dressed as religious liberties. No? When the referendum was considered dead on arrival with no support from fellow party members, President López Obrador later affirmed that the rejection reflected his own perspective. Quote, en lo que a mí corresponde, en quote, considero que este tema no debe tocarse. Ya se resolvió este tema hace más de 150 años. This topic has been dead for more than 150 years. The tension wire between religion and secularism has long been a tightrope for politicians such as Luevano Cantú and López Obrador, whose initiatives have been questioned in light of a political system that has informally, if not officially, engaged with the Catholic Church over time. This apprehension reflects what colonial studies scholar Nelson Maldonado Torres suggests as the uneasy prospect of Latin American post-colonization projects. Far from replacing the underpinnings of colonial control, secularism only reframes early modern Christianity's imperial discursive structures. Where coloniality rests in part upon secularism's ability to discreetly reconfigure Christianity's imperial grammar, the work of decoloniality exists in finding alternatives to religion and secularism as an, quote, inter-imperial event. Macro approaches to Latin American coloniality, as offered by Aníbal Quijano and Enrique Dussel, present comprehensive theoretical frameworks in which Western European modernity and coloniality are inseparable projects. Coloniality and decolonial approaches are discussed on a large narrative scale. Yet as Hispanist Ignacio Sanchez Prado and Susan Antebi observe in Latin American Keywords Project, daily actions by everyday people, often understood as, quote, popular culture, present powerful, if often overlooked, ways of approaching decolonial initiatives. This project therefore proposes a renewed turn to popular culture when considering the intersection of religion and secularization, foundational to the inheritance of Spanish colonialism in Mexico today. Turning to outlets that mostly frequently foment mass cultural transmission in the 21st century, Instagram, Twitter, and similar digital networks, I argue that social media platforms and their visual forms of communication, internet memetics, open a potent and accessible space for re-articulating colonization narratives historically managed by the Mexican state on a national level. In Mexico, this includes reimagining Catholic iconography that has been central to the country's socio-political formation from its colonial foundations. Looking at the rise of social media accounts in Mexico dedicated to decolonial education, including posts such as the meme Somos o No Somos, Are We or Are We Not, created by Querétaro-based social media account Tlacael Oficial, I ultimately suggest that the internet memetics can move us closer to decolonial initiatives as a two-part endeavor. One, decentralizing the nation state as the author of Mexico's conquest narrative, and two, locating different forms of knowledge through alternative epistemologies historically subjugated by Western modernity. I'd like to present a brief introduction here, and then we can get into the image. Social media, like other new forms of collective organization, are those bits of popular culture that not only present powerful new possibilities for long theorized ideas such as lo popular, but also re-articulate concepts such as nationalism and globalization at unprecedented speed. This comes at a time where the multiplicity of mass culture has been considered too fragmented to be considered in any unified assemblage. As Ignacio Sanchez Prado and Susan Antebi observe, products of lo popular often resist critical scholarship and is simultaneously defined, yet obscured by, its own ambiguity. Social media platforms are prime examples of pluralistic post-national interactions that characterize global power structures in the 21st century, where, quote, a notion of the popular is no longer operative to encompass productions that circulate regionally and transnationally with unprecedented speed, end quote. In her essay, Globalization and the Crisis of the Popular, Jean Franco similarly suggests that we are now at such a point of global interconnectivity that to reflect upon the popular is primarily an act of nostalgia in which firm national boundaries are no longer viable. For communities not incorporated into globalized processes, the popular may become a site of disruptive potential when official discourses fail to represent those who do not experience modernity, quote, as democracy or change or progress, end quote. As Marisa Elena Duarte affirms in Network Sovereignty, future generations, quote, face the challenge of finding out the dimensions of power and struggle that emanate from digital technologies. How these relate to the colonial present also evoke a range of possibilities for decolonial futures, end quote. They are also realizing the potential of social media as a way to interrogate perspectives that maintain indigenous communities and other marginalized groups at the periphery. In Mexico alone, the emergence of social media accounts such as Tlacael Oficial, Resistencia Tenochtitlan, Neo-Mexicanismos, and Tlatoani Moshkish reflect a concerted move towards conscientization or conscientiousness building, education, regarding pre-Hispanic cultures and the ongoing impact of Spanish conquest and colonization. Their strategic use of visual culture, videos, but also internet memes, photography, scanned images of archival documents, package colonial history in relatively quick, easy to access site bites that privilege accessibility for a mass audience. For Native peoples in particular, cyber practices are not an option. And this is Elena Duarte speaking. They are, quote, rather fundamental for engagement in Indigenous 21st century thought, end quote. At this point, I'd like to switch to a PowerPoint. We can take a look at a couple of images. I will share my screen. Fantastic. Felix, can you confirm that you can see this?
Yes, I can see it. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you. All right. Bien. El pasado más presente que nunca, the past more present than ever, Tlacael Oficial was created in 2012 by content creator Oscar Ramírez in order to, quote, devolver a los mexicanos, según poética expresión náhuatl, in Ixtli in Yotl, un rastro y un corazón para que sepan a representar y defender con pasión y orgullo la cultura, end quote. With over 1 million followers on 4 platforms, Ramírez, a lawyer who now more commonly goes by Shubloget, seeks to facilitate conversations on Mexico's current events as they intersect with indigenous and colonial inheritances. Tlacael Oficial rests with the colonial as something that actively operates in the present, and without education will continue well into its future. The account promotes historical sources, archaeological sites, museums, archives, as a way of claiming Mexican heritage. Just what objects, persons, and narratives are part of this identity come into conversation along the way. In March of 2019, Shubloget turned to social media networks when incumbent President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, sometimes referred to as AMLO, specifically acknowledged Mexico's colonial inheritances and their continued effects on the country's indigenous communities, or pueblos originarios. In a 2019 Facebook video, In a 2019 Facebook video, López Obrador revealed that he had sent letters to both the King of Spain and Pope Francis, requesting their formal apologies as, quote, a necessary step. The conquest was made by the sword and the cross. Churches were built on top of temples. They excommunicated our national heroes, Hidalgo and Morelos, end quote. The president later uploaded a video to Twitter, as well as Facebook, regarding how his administration would additionally focus on the role of the Mexican government in historical subjugation of various marginalized groups. Quote, yo luego voy a hacer una disculpa también, porque después de la colonia hubo mucha represión a los pueblos originarios, el exterminio de los yaquis, de los mayas, incluso el exterminio de los chinos en plena Revolución Mexicana, desde el Porfiriato y luego en la Revolución, y que el año 2021 sea el año de la reconciliación histórica. In general, users on López Obrador's official social media accounts questioned the president's fervent statement on pueblos originarios, given repeated political action to the contrary during his incumbency. El País, El Universal, the BBC, and the New York Times generated global coverage, while memes incorporating The Simpsons, stock photos of Felipe VII, and even new Spanish archival documents further lampooned the president for his lack of self-awareness. Xu noted through Tlacael's official Facebook page that, quote, que la ignorancia es estúpidamente atrevida si creemos que los pueblos nativos no merecen una disculpa por los últimos 500 años de marginación, discriminación y saqueos. Pues si los españoles llevan tanto tiempo haciendo negocios en este país, lo mínimo que pueden hacer es, hasta por hipocresía, ofrecer una disculpa, end quote. Ramirez eventually sought to capture these sentiments in his own account, turning to the inconsistencies of López Obrador's administration towards indigenous communities. In a post from March 27th, 2019, one day after AMLO's Facebook statement, Tlacael uploaded in a single meme titled Somos o no somos, are we or are we not, created in the popular mimetic template, pero anoche. Divided into two panels to be read as a top-down narrative, the image starts with an Aztec jaguar warrior as he battles a Spanish soldier in an illustration of La Noche Triste, which is considered the last battle before the fall of the Mexican Empire. He draws blood as the image is representative of a generalized, quote, you, demanding apologies from the Spanish crown. Below, the viewer is greeted with a much different scene. The battle between two men has suddenly changed to a photograph of a man in the heart of La Calzada, a large pedway leading up to the famous basilica dedicated to the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico City. A man totes a large image of a Mexican Madonna on his knees as a child dressed as Saint Juan Diego, the first indigenous saint of the Americas, accompanies him to the main chapel. The final text refers to the celebratory feast day of the Marian image, asking the viewer to consider, pero el 12 de diciembre. Oh, and the 12th of December. For Ramirez, posting Somos o no somos draws attention to the problematic nature of López Obrador's statements as a democratically elected official dedicated to the welfare of all Mexican citizens. Regarding the welfare of indigenous communities, the meme may invoke the consistencies between the president's recent comments vis-a-vis political policies that have actively endangered pueblos originarios under AMLO's administration. This includes politically backed projects such as El Tren Maya, a 948-mile, $16 billion intercity railway that threatens the migratory routes of endangered species, urban planning of indigenous communities, and the integrity of Mayan archaeological sites. And this is still a project that's happening currently. That López Obrador identifies Spain's spiritual conquest as essential to the erasure of pueblos originarios and indigenous lifeways, iglesias arriba de los templos, building churches on top of temples, similarly appears problematic when the Mexican government has indirectly supported the continuation of Catholic initiatives, even after 19th century independence projects. Chubloga's post garnered 41,000 reposts and over 13,000 reactions when shared across Facebook and Instagram. Some users pointed out the historical inconsistencies of AMLO's request and that Spanish conquest and colonization was not an exclusively European project. Others spoke to the futility of the president's reactions as a productive move, citing more pressing issues as national poverty. Most users debated AMLO's letters as reflecting a greater conversation on whether decolonial initiatives could be contrary to what it means to be Mexican today. Out of more than 1,000 direct comments, users such as Mario Rodriguez affirmed that, quote, somos herederos del Imperio Azteca y del Imperio Español. Negar a España es negar el mexicanismo. Que sí hubo saqueo y matanzas, claro que las hubo, pero no podemos negar quiénes somos y de dónde venimos. Other respondents, such as Maria Caban, countered that holding previous colonial powers responsible does not negate socio-political or cultural heritage. It only reinforces Western narratives, quote, minimizando el genocidio que se perpetuó en toda la América, y no solo por los españoles, sino por los portugueses e ingleses. Ultimately, a nation founded on hybridity through colonization has little sense for users such as Armando Figueroa, however, who identified the cultural importance of Mexican Catholicism and the Spanish language as proof that independence efforts do not necessarily guarantee decolonization. Quote, ¿y cómo celebran independencia si siguen hablando español y son católicos? End quote. Whether you see the aftermaths of colonialism as a spectrum or a trajectory, leaving colonialism behind consistently turns to the epistemological framework that is dismantling its underpinnings. While many similar bloggers decided to incorporate contemporary images of López Obrador as part of their rhetorical strategy, Shu's use of images that harken to the Spanish conquest, colonization, and evangelization of indigenous peoples calls our attention to a pattern of relationality that extends beyond López Obrador's administration. Where López Obrador himself acknowledged his participation in a century-long cycle of native discrimination, the visual comparison that Ramírez makes in Somos o No Somos suggests that Mexico's Estado de Derecho is not one that is automatically decolonial in nature, merely by acknowledging crimes against native communities. This is especially as colonial area institutions, such as Mexico's Catholic Church, continue to represent aspects of Mexican cultural identity today. Tlacael's use of internet memes suggests that when it comes to confronting colonial histories, we may be too quick to equate democracy and secularism with the achievement of post and/or decolonial initiatives. For many, apologies from Spain and the Catholic Church cannot and will not be effective methods of post or decolonization, as long as European configurations of sovereignty dictate the conditions under which these initiatives operate. And as Tlacael's post suggests, strong cultural affiliation for colonial era institutions such as the Catholic Church appear discordant when considering the government's commitment to historic reconciliation. A call to reconciliation may give visibility to pueblos originarios, but it does little to actively address systemic changes to the coloniality of power under which they operate. While Mexico-based social media accounts such as Tlacael Oficial, Resistencia Tenochtitlan, and Neomexicanismos, which I deal with in the larger chapter, don't identify with particular pueblos originarios, their content encourages critical inspection of Mexico's pre-Hispanic and colonial foundations as integral to address the country's systemic inequalities. These conversations ultimately shed light on what it means to think about Mexico as an entity that has experienced centuries of cultural and political change, altered by centuries of colonial rule, and still negotiates what it means to leave colonization behind, if possible. For Shu Blogger, coloniality is a transhistoric process, has the capacity to exist as, quote, un lastre que han arrastrado desde hace 5 siglos y que tal vez nunca se pueden quitar. A connecting thread that has gripped us together 500 centuries and that perhaps we'll never be able to get rid of. Whether you see the aftermath of colonialism as a spectrum or trajectory, leaving colonialism behind consistently turns the epistemological work that is dismantling its underpinnings. Media scholar Lamore Schiffman asserts that in a digital age, memes and viral videos are exceptional and that, quote, they have become highly valued pillars of a so-called participatory culture, end quote. Users who make changes to pre-existing content and reinsert it into these digital channels create socially constructed public discourses where variations speak to a multiplicity of interacting voices. But while Hispanics such as Jean Franco acknowledge that articulations of the popular have the potential to call attention to hegemonic systems, social media and other popular cultural products are no way obligated to align with destabilizing narratives. They can as easily be complicit in the systems of power, capital, and distinction, if only in partial capacity. As Shu Blogger's post suggests, these cultural items generate multiple and at times contradictory readings that do not always reflect decolonial initiatives simply by the virtue of their users or their medium. And as for closing, memes and viral videos are no trendy solution in a world where post-colonial and decolonial dialogues are just two conversations in how to imagine the after of colonial frameworks. Like similar contributors to conversations on post or decoloniality, content creators demonstrate the difficulties of imagining responses that adequately confront centuries of hegemonic practices. The association with the complex notion of popular culture further makes them a more challenging contributor to these conversations. And in terms of medium, one ultimately can't ignore that access to digital technologies can be self-limiting in its economic and geographical prerequisites. Those marginalized groups have traditionally been pushed to the bottom or excluded from hegemonic systems of power frequently remain omitted by the questions of accessibility to these digital spaces. Social media is an attractive medium precisely because it allows for possibilities that may be largely untenable off-screen. A shift in angle, time period, or place. These platforms combine with digital innovation to imagine our social circumstances as something slightly or radically different. How social media users are engaging with digital technologies brings new considerations as to how these networks can be used to think about colonial power dynamics in the 21st century. 21st century technologies are not immune as vehicles that can perpetuate colonial systems of oppression. As Tlacael Oficial has shown, however, memes can make significant interventions on how these systems may be reevaluated over time. Messy and cacophonous, their disregard for regulation and linear narratives speaks to the complex relationship that has defined Mexico's connection to colonial histories from its inception. Thank you so much.
Excellent, Beth. Thank you so much. This is so great. While you were talking about like different parts of your presentation, there were some comments in the here in the Facebook chat. For example, Dr. Diane Moneypenny was talking about something about a connection between what happens in what happened in colonial America, in the colonial America and medieval Iberia. And she says, and I quote, "It was common practice to locate churches on top of conquered mosques and temples, and vice versa. When Muslims conquered Christians' lands, they used the churches for their mosques. There is a long tradition of back and forth with bell towers, Christians, and minarets, Muslims." So I think that that's a really important connection that we have here. Also, Dr. Brian Brodeur says that same with many Christian sites, churches in Britain, which were built in Roman sites. So these different processes of colonization, of replacing, or not only replacing, but in a sense, that is the strong symbology that happens in these strong periods of conquest, where it's important just to demonstrate who is who in that situation. Something important also that I wanted to say is that some of these posts were in 2021, right? For example, what you showed today. But at least before the Native Indigenous Peoples Days or Columbus Day, for example, we also had same comments by AMLO in Mexico, and the only response that we got was from the Catholic Church, basically from Pope Francis, that spoke a little bit about it. But again, both comments, both responses, the question and the responses, got exactly the same backlash in different countries, if I'm not mistaken. Did you follow any of those controversies or those conversations?
Oh, absolutely. No, to start with the first comments there from Dr. Moneypenny and Brian Berger, it's tempting to look at social media and to think, oh, this is it's a novel thing we're looking at, these digital technologies, only really having about 20 years of kind of development to them. But when you look back, almost like these iglesias arriba de los templos, the church on top of the temples, there's a long history of kind of this image creation especially in Mexico and Latin America, and especially in colonial Spanish America, as a form of dissent and as a form of kind of popular commentary. This larger chapter, I'm looking at the ways in which viral videos and memes are specifically used to make commentaries against the Catholic Church as kind of this entity that is still perpetuating colonial practices. And we can see in viral videos using maybe religious iconography of little statues or prints that they're trying to make these jokes and the satire. But if you go back to the early modern period and you look at the archives, there were plenty of broadsides, printed documents. There were plenty of devotional materials. They were doing the same thing, making critical commentary against the Spanish crown, against the Catholic Church, looking to make their own way, especially for the colonies to establish themselves as something distinct from Spain, which I say the Virgin of Guadalupe ends up being kind of the most famous example of that. But really fascinating work. And especially we can kind of see this century after century kind of manifesting in different ways. But as you mentioned, with López Obrador, he did have some difficulty after he made this video. These were all videos and posts from 2019. And the conversation has continued, but AMLO was shamed slightly after when the Catholic Church brought up, oh, we've already issued a formal apology twice, actually, to apologize for these atrocities against Indigenous communities. and that you didn't do your research. So it can be quite curious to see how López Obrador has fielded those questions. And I would say that conversation is continuing, especially as people become more cognizant of kind of Columbus Day here in the US and the increase in Indigenous Peoples Day as an alternative.
Yes, yes, yeah, excellent points. There's actually a question from Dr. Monipani, and I'm going to read it here. She says, Beth, in my travels, I have found that some cultures, Puerto Rico, for example, glorify their indigenous past, but in a way that is very separate. They were great, but I am not indigenous, for example. That's more or less kind of the main idea. They separate themselves. They separate themselves. Do you find this in Mexico, this separation, this type of duality, or do they connect more with indigenous heritage?
That's a great question. There's a term I'm searching for. It is a very delicate balance. I am by no means the expert in this. I would say that there is more and more conversations on Mexicanidad, especially from what I've seen in Mexico City. There is a concerted attempt to bring visibility to a lot of indigenous lifeways and cultural practices. I'm thinking of the concheros. I'm thinking of different cultural groups that will do performances throughout different neighborhoods in Mexico City. I would say that in terms of identity, it is growing. I would say that these social media accounts are proof that there is interest in learning more about colonial inheritances, looking at archival documents and making them accessible to people inside and outside the do or do not have access. But it's still difficult. As I mentioned in the paper there, that when we had talked about this before we got on Facebook Live, that just because these conversations are happening, it can be difficult to really see who's identifying in all this movement when not all Indigenous communities or people who identify with Indigenous communities maybe might not have access to internet technology. That may have been wordy, but you see what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, that's true. Now talking specifically about this, and I mean, just maybe this could be one of the last questions before, because of time. So let's talk about the relative newness of social media as an archival source. What are some of the challenges of incorporating social media into approaches to colonial theory or post-colonial studies? And how do they differ or not from traditional archival sources?
That is a great question, and one that has come up in different revisions of this paper. And I would say that when I first proposed this idea that we look at social media, it was met with a lot of resistance. And a lot of resistance in that the internet is just so volatile. It gives an enormous platform to people from all walks of life and educational perspectives, which adds a great richness to this conversation. You know, if you're looking in colonial literature, we have our archival sources, we have people who are in academia and in the institution, but to really bring in perspectives from all walks of life has been pretty limited until now. But the dangers of it are, it can be difficult to track. It can be difficult to identify authentic sources, which you also have in archival studies as well. But even as I post those comments from users, it's the idea of how do you give them credibility? How do you kind of create a lasting connection? as I'm writing this paper, some of the people that I want to bring in dialogue with, some of these websites and accounts might not be available in 10 years. And there's no paper trail to kind of really mark them, except for maybe what's written on them for us. So it's something I'm still fighting with in terms of giving it visibility, and also how do you capture it? How do you add it to the archive of what we already have?
Yeah, that's very interesting, and something that we were talking about this morning at some point was the idea of the mixing and the remixing of these different type of images, and the way in which the archive sometimes I mean, especially with the immediacy of media, basically what happens is that it's very difficult to have certain kind of control or understanding of what's going on, and of course everything everything also works according to the reactions and to the responses and to where they appear in different contexts. So that's really interesting. I have another comment here, and this is kind of a question. Yes, so it's from Dr. Julian Simon. He said, in the US, the Black Lives Matter movement has sparked a conversation about the place of African American culture in the country, which mirrors what is happening in Mexico, as well as in other Spanish-speaking countries. Did the Black Lives Matter movement impact the conversation about Mexican identity?
Oh, thank you, Julian. This meme, we didn't see as much. I'd say the short answer was, unfortunately, we know, only because it was from 2019. And so we were kind of before 2020 and all the new dialogues it brought. But I would definitely say that it is in the same vein and would have easily been a precursor to these conversations that are happening now. I've witnessed over the past 2 or 3 years the presence of Indigenous creators on social media platforms, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, as a way of advocating for the communities, their cultural practices, also crimes against Indigenous communities that might not have a lot of visibility. In Canada, there was recently a discovery of a lot of mass graves of children in a lot of residential schools. And you could see several platforms trying to bring that to the forefront. You can really see that it is now increasing as we're kind of coming back out of the pandemic with these new tools and with kind of a renewed vigor to make these voices heard. But it'll always be a question of how do you continue lifting up and making space for that, which I'm hoping this presentation can do a little bit. But I'm really, anyone watching, if you have any suggestions or things that can be done better, or I'd love to hear them as I keep working on this draft. It's really really special. I appreciate it.
No, and I mean, from perspectives, for instance, from cultural studies and looking more or less at the idea of these, again, media, the presence of media, also looking at the past and working in the way in which these different archives are brought to talk about topics about the present, but with certain kind of weight from the past. That makes such an important. I mean, that this is just a really important contribution. It makes me feel like, for instance, your answer speaks directly to the Latin American experience, where issues about race in terms of the Afro-Latino communities and the indigenous communities as well, like these different separation between the mestizo and all the different groups, but also that the resistance has always been there, and at least these all different groups have been always reclaimed a space and have reclaimed a way in which they are more visible, because they are visible and we can see them everywhere, but because of media and culture they are kind of hidden. So the idea is what you were mentioning before, access, the way in which they are having direct access to the archives, access to the internet, and access to different platforms. So this is really, really good. And I think I don't know if these are questions, but basically some comments from Diane Monipenis. Can the subaltern speak? And this is from Spivak. Perhaps social media is the voice in this case. That's something that you would say, you would agree with.
Oh, I'd have to think about that. That's fantastic. The idea from Spivak is being like the subaltern. Oh, it's been a while. The subaltern can't speak because it's being mediated. Even if the subaltern can speak, we cannot hear it because it is being mediated by these colonial systems. Which is a valid point with social media, because, as I mentioned in the paper, that just because social media is social media and there's a bunch of people speaking and there's this more democratic forum, doesn't mean that it can't as easily support colonial objectives as decolonial objectives. And I think we've seen in the US alone a lot of examples of this. And so you and I had talked about this before, of with Indigenous communities, taking control of social media and making it on their terms. It is something very powerful, but it also, I've seen different users comment on, yes, we're fighting for decolonial initiatives, but we also recognize that we're participating in a colonial system because we're engaging with this system. Oh, I apologize. We're engaging with the system that's built on hegemonic Western values. You're looking at capitalism, you're looking at all these Facebook and Instagram that are all run by just these global entities, global Western entities.
Which that's the thing, because talking about this idea, it's again the eternal question of when what is post-colonial, and if we are indeed in a post-colonial society, and for instance, what is the idea of decolonialize our thoughts and the practices and the different things that happen here. Maybe I'm not going to read it, but Dr. Brodeur has shared a poem by and I lost it. Yes, by Thomas Hardy, called the Subaltern. So anybody who's in the Facebook live feed can take a look at that. But thank you, Brian. That's great. Okay, so I think that we are running out of time. But Beth, on behalf of all our colleagues in the World Languages and Cultures Department, the HSS, we want to thank you, and we feel so happy that you are with us, working with us. Our students appreciate you. You are starting excellent projects, and we fully support them. So thank you so much for accepting this invitation and for helping us celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month.
Thank you all very much. It's been a real pleasure. I look forward to your comments. Thank you again.
Good. And maybe one last thing, just remember everybody that IU East offers a BA in Spanish. Our BA has a wonderful opportunity, has a transatlantic perspective where discussions like these happen in general. So this is an invitation for anybody who's interested in our program. One of the main characteristics of our program is that we have people like Beth, and also we offer different things, especially in study abroad, and we have great support from our university. So everybody's welcome to talk to us. And well, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. So hasta luego y buena tarde.